here today to give a presentation on our experience, Belize's experience on using the Transformational Change and Sustainable Development Guide. So just to give you some background, we had a phase one ICAT project from 2020 to 2022, and it was under this phase of the project that we actually implemented this guide. One of our inputs were specifically to use this guide, which is this one here at the bottom, which is GHG, Sustainable Development and Transformational Change Impact Assessment of a selected NDC policy are performed, including a monitoring plan. Under this output, we had two main activities, and you'll notice based on the previous presentation that the activities line up with the steps within the guide that ICAT developed. So the two main activities were to describe the business as usual scenario in terms of greenhouse gas emissions of a selected policy. Under this, we would need to provide a description of the policy, select the impacts that we would assess, and then define the BAU scenario for this selected policy, considering the GHG, Sustainable Development, and Transformational Change impacts and indicators. The second main activity under this output would be then to describe the expected impacts of the implementation of the policy that we chose. This would include assessing those three perspectives: GHG, Sustainable Development, and Transformational Change, and then establishing a monitoring plan to monitor the indicators over time. So firstly, to carry out the assessment, we needed to select which policy or which NDC action we would use. From the onset here, we had some issues because we had presented some options. So firstly, I should mention that the assessment was carried out from a unit counterpart who was working with us during the implementation of the ICAT phase one project. And so we had shared some options with them, but we were realizing that we were having some issues because of the amount of data that was available for the policy. So in the end, it was decided to use Belize's National Agroforestry policy. And at the time, this policy was actually just developed. So it was like the perfect opportunity to conduct the assessment for this. So we did a GHG impact, sustainable development, and transformational change. But for the purposes of this presentation, I'll be focusing on sustainable development and transformational change. In the context of Belize, I should point out that the assessments were performed with the main goal to pilot the ICAT sustainable development and transformational change methodologies to better understand its applicability and the potential for broader use. So, well, as mentioned just now in the previous presentation, but the methodology provides a systematic approach that aims to assess what the climate policy or action has in reducing GHG emissions and ultimately contributes to the widespread transition for sustainable development. For us, the analysis could be beneficial to improve the understanding around the agroforestry policy and its contribution to national mitigation and sustainable development targets. And then the results could also generate insights on how such agroforestry practices can be strengthened in the future. So just to list some of the constraints that we had due to our national circumstances when implementing the methodologies. I mentioned that at the time, the agroforestry policy was very new. It was just completed and developed. So the assessment was an ex-ante one. So it aimed to analyze what the expected impact of the policy would be. Given the data availability that existed from the time of even choosing which policy we would use, and then even when we chose the agroforestry policy, we realized there wasn't enough detailed data to carry out a quantitative assessment. Given that this was the last output in the project as well, we were already nearing the end of the project, so time was also an issue, and then resource availability to carry out the work. If we would have wanted to actually go out to collect the data, we had some resource limitations there as well. So then this resulted in the assessment relying on qualitative approach. For the same reasons that I just listed, stakeholder participation was not included in the assessment, which instead relied mostly on this research based on available literature and the information provided in the agriculture policy itself. However, throughout the deliverable itself, the report that was developed, the author did note and indicate certain parts throughout the process where stakeholder participation would have been important and could have improved those areas of the assessment. But noteworthy, considering these limitations, the findings from the report we just wanted to mention that the findings should be viewed, used, keeping in mind the goal of the assessment, which was to pilot the guide, rather than to measure the actual impact of the policy precisely and especially quantitatively. So the application of this was an application used for a robust approach. It helps to highlight what would be the expected impact of a policy on mitigation of GHG emissions, sustainable development, and transformational change, thus allowing for a more informed identification of hotspots that should be monitored while implementing the policy, and of course, where possible areas of concern may arise. This was also very relevant for Belize because other outputs under the project at the time included developing and prioritizing other indicators specifically for our NDC, and these were also related to GHG and sustainable development as well. So while we were implementing the guide, we followed the stepwise guidance that were provided within both of the methodologies. The ICAT did provide a definition for transformational change, which was a fundamental sustained change of a system that disrupts established high carbon practices and contributes to a zero carbon society. So basically contributing to the goal of the Paris Agreement as well. It follows the methodology, which includes assessment of mitigation and sustainable development. The assessment of sustainable development references the transformational change, and as such, they were applied together during this output to maximize synergies of both of the methodologies. So again, while we were implementing the guide, and as I mentioned, the activities that fell under the output followed the steps within the guide. So we essentially did the same while actually implementing it as well. So first, we had to provide a description of our national agroforestry policy. The guide provided a table for this, and so you would input the information based on your policy or your action that you are assessing. And then you would select the impacts that you would assess in regards to sustainable development and transformational change. This was done as well. Next was the selection of the relevant impact categories, which included the identification of phase of transformation, barrier analysis, and description of the vision of the policy. Next was the baseline scenario. This was described, and then following this was the assessment of the impact of the policy as well. The sustainable development impacts were then assessed, and those were linked to the SDGs to provide an overview of the expected contribution to the Agenda 2030. So just now that was the implementation. I'll just provide some brief points or results of actually implementing the guide and what we got when assessing our agroforestry policy. So one of the first things was the identification of phase of transformation. For us, the agroforestry policy was identified to be as a takeoff stage. So this is a phase that characterizes observable moves to change the system towards more openness and acceptance of new ideas and concepts that question or challenge existing high carbon paradigms. There's an increasing awareness of problems and issues relating to unsustainable development and concrete attempts to devise possible solutions. So experimentation, innovation, and alternatives are expanding and gaining momentum. However, there is still no consensus or common understanding about suitable solutions. And then this is just a snapshot of the different stages of transformation. So there are 4 stages. This is pre-development, takeoff, acceleration, and stabilization or relapse. All of them have different characteristics that help you determine which stage or which phase your policy or action would fall in. So those highlighted in green were the ones that we identified that exist and were applicable to our agroforestry policy. So that's the reason for us determining that it was at the takeoff stage of transformation. And then the next step, as mentioned, was to define the baseline scenario. So just to note that since it relied on a qualitative assessment, just a general description would be enough. So for our policy, the baseline scenario was assumed to be a scenario in which agriculture will keep putting pressure on forests, slowly gain land, most would areas which are not labeled as conservation areas, although trespassing on certain important conservation areas is not to be excluded. Also, deforested land would be fully transformed into agricultural land composed of monocultures and traditional forms of agriculture. And during the assessment of the policy, so the policy scenario versus the DAU would be that agroforestry on a whole would just spread more widely. In areas where forests would turn to agriculture, then in the policy scenario, they would see a wider adoption of agroforestry practices. So in this scenario, some of the existing agriculture systems as well would be transformed into agroforestry, especially buffer zones. Some of the areas that are turned from forest to agriculture during the assessment period would instead be transformed into agroforestry, especially the buffer zone areas. However, this scenario does also consider a minor part in proportion of the forest areas that were not in the baseline to also be transformed into agriculture, to potentially be transformed into agroforestry as well, due to the attractiveness that agroforestry would gain as a more environmentally sustainable compromise. And then we also, these are some of the impact categories of sustainable development, the 3 main categories being environmental, social, and economic. And then these are the ones that would fall under those. So under environmental, it included climate change mitigation, biodiversity, freshwater, soil quality, and non-degradation. The same for social and economic. These are the different categories, and these are the ones as well that were applied for our assessment for the agroforestry policy. And then these are just some of the examples of how these were assessed. So 3 different tables I just provided a snapshot to show the environmental, social, and economic impact. On the side here, you could see some of the different impact categories that were listed just on the previous slide. And then we would list the specific impact, whether it's likely, possible, very likely, the impact would be moderate or minor, and then of course an overall assessment on the end. So for example, the one here on social impact for climate change adaptation, it is seen that the overall assessment is likely, moderate, and also would have a positive impact. Just to continue, so the impacts of the policy and transformational change now. As mentioned, it relied on qualitative assessment using literature and as well as information provided within the policy, as not much evidence could be gathered given the lack of data. So the assessment for this part relied and reflects the author's expert judgment based on his understanding of the policy. So since this was the approach, it was important to find a coherent way for scoring the characteristics based on the language used on the policy. So for example, in regards to the process characteristics, this was done by applying a score of 4 if the policy was absolutely clear about how a certain action affecting the process characteristics would be undertaken, and if the targets would be assigned. Another example, a score of 3 was assigned when not only if the goal was stated, but there was also a clear description of how this would be achieved. And then a score of 2 assigned if to the policy when the policy is only mentioning the intention of affecting a certain process, but no clear way of how it would actually be achieved is described. And so ultimately, in the end, the implementation of the agroforestry policy will contribute to the sustainable development goals. It will support the adaptation efforts, and as well, it will contribute to reduction of GHG emissions nationally. With that comes the end of the presentation. So thank you very much.